Hi everyone. In today's class, I want to talk about IVF and cloning. This will serve as an introduction to the whole idea of cloning. So we'll look at a couple of types of natural cloning as well as some artificial cloning, but we won't really get into the science of it all until a later part. So to start things off, IVF is basically a form of artificial fertilization. Sometimes it's called assisted fertilization because people who generally use this kind of process, they can't conceive naturally. Okay, so everything has to be assisted or done artificially. So what happens here is female's eggs are taken outside the ovary through surgery, and they will be fertilized with sperm from a male. Okay, but it all takes place outside the body in the lab, typically on a petri dish. Once the eggs are fertilized, they are then injected back into the mother's uterus, where hopefully the fertilized egg will bind onto the lining and a normal pregnancy will occur. So the only thing that is different from this type of pregnancy versus a natural pregnancy is how the egg is fertilized. The result is pretty much the same. Okay, once that fertilized egg has started to develop inside the mother's womb, it will no doubt be born 9 months later. So the first test tube baby that was born was called Louise Brown. Okay, and that occurred around 1978. I have included a YouTube link so that you can learn more about Louise Brown being the first test tube baby. If this type of procedure is something that is of interest, okay, whether it's to someone in your family or you in the future, you should know that it's quite expensive. So the average cost usually starts around $10,000, okay, to $15,000, and that's per try or per cycle. Now, you can find some organizations that will promise a much lower cost, around $6,500 per cycle, but in Canada, it's generally around $15,000. Depending on the types of medications and hormones that might be needed, that price can go up to as high as $30,000 per cycle. Unfortunately, on average, it does take about 2 to 3 cycles to be successful. Okay, so if you were successful on the first cycle, great, then that's probably around 15,000. If you need 2, that'll be about 30,000. If you need 3 cycles, that's about 45,000. So very, very expensive, but for people who can't conceive in any other way, this does give them hope of having a family. I will note that in Canada, it is illegal to pay someone to donate their eggs and sperm. Okay. However, there are some states in the United States that do allow payment for these gametes. In those particular states, you can earn as much as $100 per sperm sample, and depending on the state again, some eggs might go for about $8,000 American. So it is a business for some people and for some organizations, and it's something that Canadian Medicare does not cover. So if you're going to go with IVF, you will mostly pay out of your own pocket for this. So I will also include a link to show you the process of how IVF works. And I may also provide a couple of links in terms of some of the risks that egg donors might encounter, if that's something that you know someone who may want to do in the future. So, moving into the actual cloning. Natural cloning already exists. So cloning as an idea is not something new. Okay, it's not revolutionary. But in nature, it happens in a couple of ways. First, we see natural cloning occurring in bacteria, as well as in eukaryotic cells, such as our own body cells. So whatever a cell reproduces, it reproduces by mitosis. Okay. This is where a parent cell makes a copy of itself by splitting, like physically splitting up into two separate entities. So these two cells, called daughter cells, in the end, are exactly identical to the parent. In larger organisms, okay, so more multicellular organisms like plants, cloning also occurs, but in the form of what we refer to as asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction just means that you don't need a partner in order to trade genetic information to reproduce. You can reproduce on your own. So usually if you're reproducing on your own, you are making a clone of yourself or a copy of yourself. For plants, it could be as simple as a potato sprouting out these little sprouts. So each one of these will eventually grow into a separate plant, but DNA-wise, it is identical to the parent plant. Now, this image here is of a special type of worm called a flatworm. Okay, flatworms do reproduce asexually as well, and flatworms have the oddest way of making another copy of itself. Basically, it makes a copy of itself when it's damaged. So if I were to cut a flatworm in half, the tail end will grow a head, the head end will grow a new tail, and those two flatworms would be identical to each other genetically. Okay, they may not look alike, okay, because one might have a shorter body than the other, but they are identical in DNA. Now, this one here, instead of cutting it in half, okay, in the middle there, someone has made a cut, a horizontal cut through the head, okay, and down to the mid part of the body, splitting the upper portion in two. So when the flatworm tries to quote-unquote repair itself, it does so by forming two heads, okay, and each one of these heads literally has a mind of its own because they're not necessarily one organism anymore. Okay, so we'll look at this flatworm in a lot more detail when we get into biodiversity, but this is like one of my favorite types of organisms. So most bacteria cells, eukaryotic cells, plants, and simple multicellular organisms, okay, they will naturally use mitosis as a way of creating exact copies of themselves, and therefore clones. If we're looking at more complex multicellular organisms, like humans, the only way that right now where we can get natural clones is basically by splitting the egg naturally. Okay, so when an egg splits, you get twins. When it splits 3 times, you get triplets. This image here, you have 5 identical humans, okay, all girls. And here you have 7, okay, septuplets. So in animals, okay, like more complex animals like humans, the only evidence that we see of natural cloning is usually when an egg copies itself and then splits multiple times. There are examples of other complex animals that can produce, again, copies of itself, okay, but it's not what we're thinking of in terms of cloning an individual. Okay, it's more like replacing a missing limb by cloning certain organs, okay, which is technically still a natural process for them, okay, but it's not like cloning the entire individual. Okay. So now that we looked at some some natural forms of cloning. Let's move on to the artificial types of cloning. The first type, okay, of two is called reproductive cloning. So in reproductive cloning, we copy the entire organism. Okay, this is what most people think cloning is about. And one of the more famous clones that we have is basically this sheep over to the left here. This sheep is originally named Dolly. Okay, her significance is she was the first successfully cloned sheep that ended up surviving the cloning process. A lot of the times cloning ends up in failure, okay, and Dolly was basically a success story. The second type of cloning is called therapeutic cloning. Now, this is a more reasonable application of the cloning process. Okay, this is where we copy cells or organs or tissues, okay, in the hopes of treating diseases or replacing damaged organs. So you're never copying the entire organism, only parts of an organism. So what you see down below here is a beating heart, okay, but it's not any beating heart. This heart was basically cloned from the DNA of a donor, okay, likely the person who requires a certain heart transplant. Okay, the benefit here, okay, is great. Usually, if you have a regular heart transplant, you're putting someone else's heart in your body, and your body won't recognize the cells as being your own, so your body ends up attacking that implanted heart. But with cloning, if you can take your own cells and make them into heart tissue, okay, that your body recognizes as being yours, then there's no chance of rejection. So this type of cloning is quite useful, and it has saved a lot of lives. Now, before we go further, okay, I do want you to take some time and perhaps take this particular survey. I want you to basically think about whether or not you agree with the statements that's given on this list over here. Okay, if you agree, you just check off approve. If you don't agree, you check off disapprove. And I believe that you should have a copy of this already. If not, I can give you a copy the next time we see each other in class. But I do want to start thinking about this entire cloning topic from different perspectives. But I do want you to also know what your own beliefs are. Okay, so go through a list, check off whether you approve or disapprove. There's no right or wrong answer. These are just your opinions. And the next time we see each other, we will basically go through some of the pros and cons of cloning, and we'll also take a look at a couple of the actual cloning processes and the science behind them. All right, see you guys next time.